The room had gone quiet in a way that a room built for 30,000 civilizations was not designed to go quiet. Tavan's soul sat at the human delegation table. One table, one chair. The translation matrices which ran continuously in this chamber, a layered hum so constant that delegates stopped hearing it within their first week, had gone silent. Not failed. Silent. There is a difference, and every species in the upper tiers understood it. He did not look at Provost Drath. He did not look at the observation feeds. He set his folded pages on the table in front of him and placed both hands flat beside them. 11 seconds. He counted. Nobody moved. 11 seconds of silence. 30,000 civilizations, and not one of them spoke. You'll want to know what he said to earn that. 72 hours earlier, the document had arrived at 300. Smell was the first thing, or rather the absence of it. High-pressure courier packaging, vacuum-sealed, opened in a cabin with recycled air that carried the faint mineral tang of the Waymark's filtration system, and the pages inside carried nothing. No smell at all. Official assembly documents were printed on a composite material that did not absorb atmosphere. The reasoning was practical. Documents that passed through multiple atmospheric environments should arrive neutral, uncontaminated, objective. What it meant in practice was that no matter where you opened them, they felt like they came from nowhere. Tavan had been an envoy for 14 years. He had opened a great many assembly documents in a great many cabins. He noticed the smell or the absence of it every time. Some habits of attention don't stop being useful just because they've become automatic. He read the cover notation standing up. He always read standing, a habit from his early postings, when 4 delegates had shared a workspace the size of a reasonable closet, and desk space was a negotiated resource. The habit had outlasted every posting that produced it. His staff found it mildly eccentric. He had stopped explaining it. The cover read, "Final Notice of Compliance, issued to the human delegation by authority of the Accord Assembly, Cycle 7882. He set the document on the desk without opening it. Then he picked it up again and began to fold it. Even thirds, left panel first, then right. His hands moved without instruction, while he looked out the observation port at the quorum ring. The quorum ring floated in the middle distance, amber gold in the light of a star that no human cartographer had given a formal name. It was an orbital structure the approximate diameter of a small gas moon, ringed with docking spurs and signal relays that caught the light and scattered it in slow geometric patterns across its surface. Tavan had stood at this same window dozens of times over 14 years. He had watched the ring during trade summits, border negotiations, 2 separate sessions that had come within a vote of becoming something considerably worse. It had never looked like a threat before. That morning it did. He unfolded the document and read it. He read it standing because that was how he read, and because sitting down felt, just then, like the wrong posture for whatever this was going to require of him. The violation list ran to 19 points. Not suggestions, not areas of concern flagged for review. Violations, a word that carried specific legal weight under the Accord's founding charter, the document that governed every spacefaring civilization registered in this region of the galaxy. He read each point slowly because he had learned long ago that the worst thing a diplomat can do is react before he understands. His first supervisor had told him that. She had been wrong about a number of things over the years, but not that one. Violation 1, unauthorized settlement of restricted expansion zones. 4 planetary systems that the Assembly had designated as protected buffer space. Tavan had the summary of each system in memory. He had read these files 3 years ago when the first informal complaint had come through channels. 2 planets uninhabited and resource-stable. 1 with a decaying magnetosphere that humanity's engineers had stabilized within 8 years of arrival. 1 that had been on the Assembly's own internal survey schedule for 2 centuries and simply hadn't been surveyed yet, due to what the administrative log described as backlog reallocation. The Assembly's violation report did not mention the magnetosphere. It did not mention the survey backlog. He noted this and kept reading. Violation 7, refusal to provide technical documentation for the Fold Advance drive system under the shared knowledge mandate. The Fold Advance had cut travel time between star systems by a factor of 9. It was the single most significant propulsion development in humanity's contact era history, and the Assembly wanted the full documentation file within 60 cycles. Tavan knew the mandate's exact language. He had read it at the time of the refusal and had agreed with the refusal. The clause in question transferred partial developmental ownership of any shared technology to the governing body. 3 species had shared technology under this clause in the past 40 cycles. Two of them had subsequently been unable to develop the next generation of that technology without assembly approval. That approval had been withheld in both cases for reasons the official record described as administrative timing. Taven had read the unofficial record. The reasons were political. Humanity had read the precedent and declined to participate in it. Violation 12, he stopped when he reached that one. Set the document down, looked at the stars for a moment. The Vesson relay incident. One of humanity's deep-range communication relays had emitted a signal pulse that interfered with an assembly navigation beacon for 6 hours. A trade convoy had been rerouted. 11 days added to their journey. The financial loss was documented and significant. What the violation report did not note. The relay error had been identified within the first hour, correction had begun within the second, and full resolution had been achieved within 11 hours. Compensation to all affected trade partners had been completed within 72 hours. The Assembly's own technical estimate for repairing the navigation beacon had been 4 months. Humanity had repaired it in 11 days. The document listed this as a violation. He read through the remaining points with the same attention he had brought to the first 12. By the end, the tea he had made during the reading had gone cold on the corner of the desk. He had forgotten to drink it, which was unusual. Taven generally remembered tea. Reading through all 19 points felt, in aggregate, like reading a list of everything humanity had done to survive, written by civilizations that had never needed to. The formal summons to the full session arrived at 700. He put on his coat, left the tea where it was, and walked into the most important meeting of his career without a single prepared note. The chamber was extraordinary, as it always was. An enormous circular space with tiered seating arranged around a central platform, the ceiling transparent above, stars stretching beyond it in every direction. The ambient hum of 30,000 translation feeds filled the air at a frequency you felt in your back teeth before you heard it with your ears. 10,000 observation feeds lined the upper ring with their particular faint electric blue, transmitting everything to civilizations that could not be present in person. Taven took his seat at the human delegation table. One table, as always, one chair. Provost Kalan Drath of the Vorath Compact rose to speak. The Vorath were the Assembly's oldest active enforcement body, the civilization that had drafted the original compliance architecture 11,000 years ago and had held the senior voice position through every revision since. Drath himself was 7.5 feet of smooth, dark-ridged exoskeletal plating, 4 forward-facing optical clusters giving him 300-degree simultaneous vision, and a posture that communicated, without any particular effort, that he had been doing this longer than most civilizations in the room had been civilizations. He carried the designation Rod, blackened mineral, ceremonial, understood by every species in the chamber to mean that what followed was not an opening position. His translator rendered each word in the flat, even cadence that assembly formal proceedings required. It was a voice designed to sound like the conclusion of an argument that had already been won. The Accord Assembly, Drath said, having reviewed the conduct of the human civilization across 31 registered cycles, and having issued 4 prior notices of concern, each of which had been acknowledged and not addressed, hereby delivers to the human delegation a final directive. He read the conditions clearly, 4 of them. Governance of 14 colonial settlements transferred to joint assembly administration. Full technical documentation of the Fold Advanced Drive System within 60 cycles. A standing inspection agreement covering all military and research installations. And a formal written acknowledgement, entered into the Assembly record, of the Accord Assembly's supreme governing authority over this region of space. Failure to comply with all 4 conditions within 90 cycles would result in collective quarantine, total severance from galactic trade networks, communication blackout, physical exclusion from all Assembly-governed space lanes. Every other civilization in the chamber would be legally required to cut contact. No exceptions, no timeline for review. Drath finished speaking and sat down. Taven did not stand. He did not speak. The protocol in that moment was to acknowledge receipt of the summons, return to one's delegation quarters, and respond within the allotted window. He had 72 hours. He stood, nodded once to the chamber, a single-level acknowledgement, and walked out. Back aboard the Waymark, he sat at his communications terminal and wrote one message to Earth. He kept it short because there was no way to make it not short. They have done it, 4 conditions, 90 cycles or collective quarantine. Tell me what to say. He sent it and made tea. This time he drank it. Deep space relay communication to Earth took time. Even with the booster chain along the route, a signal required hours for the round trip. He had 72 hours total. The message would arrive on Earth in roughly 3 hours. A reply would take another 3 to reach him. That left him 66 hours to prepare and deliver humanity's formal response. He stood at the observation port. The quorum ring floated where it always had. The star that lit it had no human name. He had never found that troubling before. He thought about the 14 civilizations that had received final compliance notices in the Assembly's recorded history. He had looked up their cases once, years ago, as a matter of professional due diligence when he'd first understood the general shape of where things between humanity and the Assembly were heading. He remembered the broad outlines. 4 of those 14 had attempted to resist the collective quarantine. None of those 4 were in the chamber today. Not because of any dramatic confrontation. Because isolation, applied with patience and institutional thoroughness, is a force that does not need to be loud to be effective. Cut a civilization off from trade, from communication, from the movement of resources and information, and it begins to make decisions from a position of shrinking options rather than stable ones. 2 of those 4 had actually been growing before the quarantine hit. One had been building new colony ships when the blockade was formalized. It had not mattered. Tavin considered this for a while. Then he turned from the window and opened an archive file he had held access to for 31 years and never once used. The Accord Assembly maintained a comprehensive historical archive, centuries of records, open by procedural courtesy to any registered delegation. Trade agreements, border resolutions, species classification documents, session records going back to the Assembly's founding era. Most delegations used the public-facing sections for research and precedent review. Very few, in Tavin's experience, went deeper. He went deeper. He searched for 2 things specifically: human references and quarantine precedents. The human references came back more extensively than he had expected. The Assembly's observational record on humanity predated first contact with any Assembly species by 70 years. Survey instruments had been present in the solar system, while humanity was still running the first serious feasibility studies on permanent lunar infrastructure. Every report those instruments filed had been archived. Every archive was accessible to an accredited delegate. He read all of it. This took 4 hours. The tea went cold twice. He did not notice either time until he reached for the mug and found it at the wrong temperature. The early classifications were standard administrative language for a pre-contact civilization. Category 3, high internal conflict potential, unpredictable developmental trajectory. The kind of notation a careful analyst applies to a species that hasn't done anything remarkable yet but bears watching. Routine. What was not routine was the way the classification had been updated. Every other species in the Assembly's observation record had followed a predictable arc: language, agriculture, industry, information networks, early space capability, each step taking roughly the expected number of generations. The models were not guesses. They were drawn from a database of hundreds of civilizations across thousands of years. They were, for most subjects, quite accurate. For humanity, the models had kept producing errors. Not because humanity had skipped steps, because the intervals between steps had consistently been shorter than the models projected. Every time the record indicated humanity should plateau, should consolidate gains, stabilize, take the time the models said it would take, humanity had instead accelerated. The analysts had noted this, updated the models, and watched humanity exceed the new projections as well. One note written by an analyst whose name the archive rendered in a script Tavin's implant translated without difficulty. Read: "This species responds to obstacles by moving faster. Recommend continued observation. Do not interfere." Someone had underlined the last 3 words. In the margin in a different script, a single word had been added. The translator rendered it as agreed. Tavin sat with that for a moment. Then he kept reading. The quarantine precedents were harder to locate. They were not filed under any word that translated as quarantine. They were cataloged under a phrase that came through as administrative cessation protocol. 14 cases across the past 2 millennia. In 12, a final compliance notice similar to his own had been issued. In 4 of those 12, resistance had been attempted. He already knew the outcome. Reading the actual case files made the knowing feel different. One of them had been 40 years into an expansion phase when the blockade hit. Another had 17 new agricultural installations under construction on a colony world. The files noted these details in the same, even administrative language as everything else. As if there were no particular significance to documenting the specific things a civilization had been building when it stopped being able to build. Tavin noted all of this carefully. He was building something in his mind, though he was not yet sure of its shape. At the 18-hour mark, he closed the archive, put on a jacket against the Waymark's recycled air, and walked to the Tessarene archive. The Tessarene was the Assembly's Xenoanthropological Research Wing, a public access section of the Quorum Ring, open to any accredited delegate. Taven had been there once before, 7 years ago, for a conference on interspecies communication standards. He had found it interesting in the abstract way of a place that studied things he was adjacent to, but not the subject of. The human exhibit was not difficult to find. Mid-sized installation, positioned between a much larger display for the Vorath and a smaller one for a species Taven didn't recognize. The classification panel at the entrance read, in standard assembly script that his implant translated without effort. Species human, origin third planet Sol system. Assembly membership 31 cycles, category unpredictable. Threat ceiling unquantifiable, recommended posture containment. He stood in front of it for a long time. Unpredictable, threat ceiling unquantifiable. These were not, in assembly terminology, insults. Unpredictable meant the assembly's analysts had attempted to model human behavior and found the models produced unreliable results. Threat ceiling unquantifiable meant they had attempted to determine the upper limit of humanity's potential, the ceiling above which the species could not reasonably be expected to develop, and had failed to identify one, not because the ceiling didn't exist, because they couldn't find it. He had not known that before that morning. He was not yet certain what to do with it. "You read Pellin fast," said a voice behind him, for a human. Taven turned. A slight figure in pale gray stood a few meters away, small build, large dark eyes set wide in a pale face, the careful, deliberate posture common to the Pellin. The Pellin had been assembly members for over 4,000 years. Their civilization had been built, in the most literal sense, around the act of studying other civilizations. They regarded observation as a form of respect. They were very good at both. "The translation implant does the reading," Taven said. "I just look at the words." "Still," the researcher said, "most human delegates do not come to this wing." He introduced himself as Essen. He had been studying humanities file for 6 years, he said, in the same tone someone uses to mention a long-running project they are quietly proud of. They sat in the alcove adjacent to the exhibit. 2 chairs, a low table, the soft, sourceless light that characterized the entire wing. Essen had brought something warm in a container he set on the table between them without offering it, which Taven had come to understand was a Pellin conversational signal meaning, "I am staying for a while. You may as well also stay." Essen talked, Taven listened. This was, he had found, generally the more useful distribution of those two activities in conversations that mattered. The Pellin researcher was careful with his words. He paused often, watching Taven's face between sentences, as if checking that each one had landed correctly before releasing the next. He had been studying humanities file for 6 years. He believed, he said, that Taven deserved to understand the full picture, not because he had been instructed to share it, because he had spent 6 years learning how humans thought, and he believed that accurate information, in this particular situation, served everyone better than the alternative. 3 weeks ago, the Vorath Compact had proposed a measure to the full council. Essen did not use the Assembly's term for it. He said there was no clean translation. It described a type of intervention the Assembly had used twice in its entire history, both times on civilizations that had been assessed as structural threats to galactic stability. Not a quarantine, not a blockade. Something that did not leave the subject civilization in a position to respond. The measure had been proposed, and it had been blocked. 3 council elders had refused to allow it to proceed to a formal vote. Essen reached into his bag and set a small data card on the table. He did not slide it toward Taven. He placed it on the table with 2 fingers and then withdrew his hand, as if the card's position was something to be negotiated. The 3 elders who had blocked the measure, Essen said, had submitted a joint statement. It had been entered into the session record. He had not told Taven about it during their first exchange of messages because he had not been certain it was appropriate to share. He had since reconsidered. He looked at the card. After reviewing the complete observational archive on the human civilization, covering 112 years of documentation, the statement read, "The undersigned find themselves unable to recommend any action intended to terminate or permanently restrict this species' development. Their reasons, as documented. First, every intervention model applied had produced the same result. Humanity, when subjected to external pressure of any kind, isolation, resource restriction, physical threat, did not diminish. It accelerated. The models could not account for this reliably. Second, the historical record of this species contained no example of a civilizational collapse followed by permanent decline. In every case, Within a generation or two, recovery had exceeded the previous level. Third, the undersigned believed, based on 112 years of observation, that attempting to impose a permanent ceiling on this species would not succeed. It would instead produce a version of humanity that was no longer interested in being part of the assembly. Essen stopped. He looked at the card for a moment. The final sentence of the statement, he said, was the one that had ended the discussion. He read it without inflection, in the careful way of someone delivering something they want to be heard precisely as written. We have watched the recordings of their history. We will not be the civilization that provokes them. If we are wrong about this, we will discover our error. If we are right, history will record that we were wise enough to know what we were looking at. The alcove was quiet. The sourceless light made no sound. Which elder wrote the last line? Tavin asked. All three, Essen said. They submitted it as a single document. None of them would take individual credit. Tavin looked at the container of something warm on the table. He had not touched it. He picked it up now. Whatever it contained had gone lukewarm. What happens next? He asked. Essen was quiet for a moment. The full council has convened a closed session. The agenda, as I understand it, is this question. How does the assembly build a functional relationship with a civilization it cannot contain, cannot reliably predict, and cannot outpace? He picked up the container on his side of the table, set it back down. There is no existing framework for that question, he said. In the assembly's history, it has never been asked before. Every other civilization, however capable, has followed a trajectory the assembly could eventually model. Your species is the first for which our best analysts cannot produce a confident long-range projection, because you keep surprising us. Because we keep surprising ourselves, Tavin said. Essen considered this. That is actually the harder problem to model. A civilization that is surprised by its own capabilities cannot be bounded by external assumptions, because those assumptions will always be derived from what the civilization has already done, and you always do something you have not done before. He stood to leave. At the doorway he paused. I want you to know, he said, that I do not believe the assembly is your enemy. I also do not believe they are your friends. I think they are a very old institution that has spent thousands of years believing it understood the range of what was possible. And you have spent 31 years quietly dismantling that belief without meaning to. That is a genuinely difficult thing to manage. I know, Tavin said. Essen nodded and left. Tavin remained in the alcove for a few minutes after the researcher's footsteps faded down the corridor. There was a particular quality to what he was carrying now, not the document, not the data card, not even the archive records, the shape of something. He had the structure of it. He did not yet know its precise dimensions. He walked back to the waymark. The communicate from Earth arrived 6 hours after he had sent his message. 3 hours faster than the relay math suggested, which meant someone had rerouted it through the priority channel without being asked. It came not from the diplomatic corps, not from the Foreign Affairs Office or the Assembly Liaison Team. It came directly from the Secretary General's personal terminal. Her name was Cecile Acaffer. She had been in office for 8 years. Tavin had met her 4 times. Each time she had struck him as someone who thought in long sentences but spoke in short ones, and who had no patience for the difference between what was true and what was convenient. The message was 3 sentences. He read them once. He read them again. His hands, which he had not noticed were slightly unsteady until that moment, went completely still. Something settled in his chest, not calm exactly. Something adjacent to it. The specific feeling of having been uncertain for a long time and finding, without warning, that you had actually known the answer the whole while. You had simply been waiting for someone else to say it first. He folded the message into even thirds, set it beside the terminal. Then he called Earth again, not a formal communication, just a direct channel to the Secretary General's office. Her assistant answered. Tavin told him what Essen had told him. The 3 elders, the measure proposed, the statement entered into the session record, the final line that had ended the discussion. There was a pause. Then the assistant said he would pass it along and asked Tavin to hold. Cecile Acaffer came on herself 4 minutes later. Her voice was steady and precise, the way it always was. Tavin told her everything. The archive, the classification records, the analyst's marginal note with the single translated word beneath it. Essen, the measure that had been proposed and blocked. The reason the 3 elders had given. He told her all of it. There was a silence on the line, long enough that Tavin checked the connection indicator. Then she said, We know, we have known for 2 weeks, keep going. The line closed. Tavin sat in his chair and looked at the observation port. The quorum ring floated where it always did. The amber light caught the docking spurs, and scattered across the surface in slow patterns. He thought for a while about what it meant that Earth had known the full scope of what was on the table, had known about the proposed measure, about the three elders, about the session record, and had still sent him 3 sentences and told him to keep going. He stopped thinking about it, because understanding exactly what it meant was not what the next 36 hours required of him. What the next 36 hours required was that he finish building what he had started. He worked through the night, not on the speech he had originally planned, the formal diplomatic response, the carefully structured point-by-point rebuttal that the occasion technically called for. He had begun writing that version before the archive session, and had found, by the time he returned from the Tessarine, that it was the wrong instrument for what he needed to do. He deleted 3 opening paragraphs, started again, deleted an apology he had drafted in 2 different registers, started again. At 200 he got up, walked to the small galley unit and made coffee rather than tea, which was the Waymark's other option and which he generally reserved for situations that required a different kind of attention. By 400, he had something he believed in. Not a speech, not a rebuttal, something older than either. A reading of the record. A plain statement of what had happened and why, and what it meant, organized not as argument but as evidence and trusted to carry its own weight. He printed it on paper. He kept a small stock of it aboard for occasions when physical thinking helped, when the act of holding pages and turning them did something that a screen could not. He printed the full document and read it once from beginning to end, standing at his desk in the quiet of the ship. He adjusted 1 paragraph near the middle, changed nothing else. Then he straightened his coat at the airlock, a routine check, the same gesture he made before every session, tucked the folded pages under his arm and walked back into the quorum ring. The full session had been called for 900. Tavin arrived 12 minutes early, which was not unusual for him. What was unusual was that he stood outside the main chamber entrance for a moment before going in, not hesitating, exactly, taking the measure of something. The corridor was empty at that hour, the amber-tinted light of the ring's artificial cycle casting long, even shadows across the floor. Somewhere behind the sealed chamber doors, 30,000 translation feeds were warming up. He tucked the folded pages more firmly under his arm and went in. The chamber was full, not the ordinary full of a standard session, where perhaps a third of the tiers held active delegates and the rest were represented by automated feeds. Full in the way a room gets when word has traveled that something is going to happen that cannot be watched secondhand. Every tier occupied. The 10,000 observation feeds in the upper ring running at capacity, their faint electric blue washing the highest levels of the chamber in a light that reminded Tavin, faintly, of deep water. He had spoken in this chamber many times over 14 years. Trade resolutions, clarification requests, 2 goodwill addresses during the early cycles of humanity's membership, when the Assembly's diplomatic protocols had required them. Each time, the room had maintained its usual ambient hum, the layered frequency of 30,000 translation feeds processing simultaneously, the faint mechanical breath of the atmospheric management systems, the occasional movement from the upper tiers as delegates shifted or conferred quietly with their aides. The room was never truly silent. It was a room built for ongoing civilization. Tavin walked to the human delegation table, set his pages down, and waited. Provost Drath rose to read the formal terms into the session record, a procedural requirement before any official response could be entered. He did this in the same flat, verdict cadence he had used the day before. The 4 conditions, the 90-cycle window, the consequences. His designation rod sat on the Vorath table in front of him, the blackened mineral catching no light at all. When Drath finished and sat down, the chamber waited. Tavin stood. He walked to the central platform, set the pages on the podium, looked at them for a moment, the printed sheets, folded into even thirds, the crease lines from the night's repeated handling visible even from where he stood. He picked them up, folded them once more, and set the speech aside. Then he unfolded the paper, and the room went quiet. Not the managed quiet of a chamber that has called for order. Not the brief silence between one speaker finishing and the next beginning. Something else. The translation feeds, which processed continuously regardless of whether anyone was speaking, went to a kind of minimum hum that Tavin had not heard in 14 years of sessions. The atmospheric systems seemed to pull back. The delegates in the upper tiers, thousands of them, went still in the particular way of beings who have decided that whatever is about to happen deserves their full attention. He had stood on this platform many times. The room had never felt like this before. He did not open with an apology. He had written 3, each one carefully constructed, acknowledging the assembly's concerns before addressing them, a gesture of diplomatic goodwill that protocol recommended and experience had taught him could diffuse adversarial rooms. He had deleted all three before printing the final document, not because he was being defiant, because an apology would have implied that the dossier's framing was accurate, and the dossier's framing was not accurate. The Assembly's formal notice lists 19 points of noncompliance, he said, his voice carried without effort. The chamber's acoustic design had been doing this for longer than humanity had writing. I am not going to dispute the list. Every item on it is factually correct. I am going to explain each one in order, because I believe the Assembly deserves to understand not just what humanity did, but why. And I believe that once you do, you will find that every decision we made followed the same logic that has governed every decision humanity has made across the entirety of its recorded history. He began with the first violation, the 4 colonial settlements. He gave the name of each system. He gave the assessment his scientists had conducted before settlement, the 2 systems that were uninhabited and resource stable, the one with the failing magnetosphere that his engineers had stabilized within 8 years of arrival, the 4th that had been on the Assembly's own survey schedule for 219 cycles, with no survey yet conducted. He noted that formal settlement notifications had been filed with the Assembly's expansion registry for each, that all 4 notifications had been received and logged, that no response had been issued to any of them. We interpreted silence as non-objection, he said. We were apparently wrong about that. We should have been told clearly. We were not. The folded Vance refusal. He read the exact text of the Shared Knowledge Mandate's ownership clause. Then he summarized the case histories of 3 species that had shared technology under this clause and had subsequently found themselves unable to develop the next generation of that technology without Assembly approval that had been withheld, in 2 of the 3 cases, for reasons the official record listed as administrative and the actual record listed as political. He named the species. He cited the cycle numbers. We declined not out of selfishness, he said, but out of a straightforward reading of what the precedent showed. We have always been prepared to discuss a modified arrangement. No one asked. The Vesson relay incident. He kept this one brief. Error identified in hour 1. Correction begun in hour 2. Full resolution in 11 hours. Compensation to all affected trade partners completed within 72 hours. The Assembly's own repair estimate for the affected navigation marker, 4 months. We do not consider this a violation, he said. We consider it an error that we fixed. We are sorry for the disruption. We are not sorry for fixing it faster than it had been estimated. He worked through all 19 points the same way, not dismissing them, not minimizing them, placing each one in its actual context, with the relevant documentation cited in the same measured voice he would have used to read a technical report to a working group. Somewhere around violation 11, he became aware that the quality of attention in the room had changed. It was difficult to define precisely. The stillness was the same. The translation feeds were the same, but something in the particular texture of the room's silence had shifted. The adversarial quality, the sense of a verdict already reached, a room waiting to be vindicated, had become something else. Uncertain. 30,000 civilizations, recalibrating. He turned to the next page. The Assembly has issued collective quarantine to 14 civilizations in the past 2,000 years, he said. I have reviewed all 14 cases. In 12 of those cases, a final compliance notice similar to the one I received 4 days ago was issued. 4 of those 12 attempted to resist the quarantine. He paused, let the number settle. None of those 4 are present in this chamber today. The stillness that followed was a different kind than the one at the beginning of his address. This one had weight. I want to address that directly. The Assembly's position, as I understand it, is that quarantine functions as a corrective measure, a way of encouraging compliance through the pressure of isolation. I understand why it has worked before. Isolation is a patient force. Cut a civilization off from trade, from communication, from the movement of resources and information. And over time, that civilization makes decisions from shrinking options rather than stable ones. It agrees to things it would not have agreed to from a position of strength. That is the mechanism. I understand it. He looked up from the pages. He looked at the chamber, all of it, the complete circle of tiers. The thousands of faces and forms and sensory apparatus turned toward the central platform. The observation feeds in the upper ring, recording everything for civilizations that had not been able to be present in person. But I need the Assembly to understand something about humanity, not as a threat, not as defiance, as a factual statement about our history, which is in your archive, which you have been observing for over a century, and which I believe you know but may not have fully considered in this particular context. He let one beat of silence fall before continuing, not for effect, because what came next needed room. Humanity has never stayed down, not once. In the entirety of our documented history, 5,000 years of civilization, 7 separate extinction-level pressures, plagues that reduced our population by fractions that in a smaller species would have meant a final chapter. We have lost ground, grieved, and rebuilt, not to the previous level, beyond it, every single time. The chamber was very still. This is not a boast. I want to be precise about that. This is a pattern, a behavioral pattern so consistent across our entire recorded history that it is not a choice anymore. It is simply what we do. We do not decide to get back up. Getting back up is what our civilization has always done because not getting back up is something we have never successfully learned. He turned to the last page. The Secretary General's 3 sentences. He had thought during the night about how to introduce them, whether to provide context, to explain who Cecil Ockafer was, to frame the response as an official document from a head of government. He had decided, by 300, not to introduce them at all. The Secretary General of Earth asked me to deliver the following as humanity's formal response to the final notice. I quote directly. He read the 3 sentences. They were not a declaration. They were not a threat. They were a plain observation about a pattern of behavior that 5,000 years of documented human history had demonstrated with complete consistency. We have been here before. We have always found a way forward. We are not asking for permission to continue doing so. He folded the paper. I would like to add one line of my own, he said. It is not part of the official response. It is my personal assessment as the human being who has sat in this chamber for 14 years. He looked at Provost Drath. A quarantine works when the civilization being quarantined is capable of accepting its situation and becoming smaller over time. We have studied your history, Provost, and we respect what the Assembly has built across thousands of years. But we must be honest with you, because honesty is the only thing that serves either of us here. We are not capable of becoming smaller. We have tried, across our history in different forms, under different circumstances, and it has never held. We adapt, we grow, we find the way through. This is not defiance. This is description. And we believe the Assembly deserves an accurate description of what it is considering. He picked up his pages. We are ready to negotiate on every point in the dossier. We have always been ready to negotiate. What we are not able to do is sign a document promising to stop being what we are. We hope the Assembly will find, on reflection, that they would not want us to. He stepped off the platform, and the room went quiet in a way that a room built for 30,000 civilizations was not designed to go quiet. Tavin walked back to the human delegation table. One table, one chair. He set his folded pages down, placed both hands flat on the surface beside them. 11 seconds. He counted. The translation matrices, which had been processing at minimum hum throughout his address, went to something close to silence. Not failure. Choice. As if 30,000 translation systems had simultaneously decided that what had just been said did not require immediate processing, that it needed to be held first. Nobody moved in any tier. Nobody spoke. The observation feeds continued to record, their electric blue unchanged, transmitting the silence to civilizations watching from across the Assembly's range. 30,000 civilizations, sitting with the same information, arriving each in their own way at the same uncomfortable place. Not a victory, Tavin knew that. He was too experienced to mistake the particular quality of that silence for triumph. It was something else. The sound, or rather, the absence of sound, of a very old institution encountering something its models had not prepared it for, and taking a moment, for the first time in a very long time, to simply sit with not knowing what came next. Then the translation matrices began working again, thousands of them simultaneously, resuming like a tide coming back in. The chamber filled with the layered hum of 30,000 civilizations processing the same speech at the same time, each in its own language, each arriving at its own version of the same question. Tavin sat down and waited. 4 days passed. He did not sleep well. He slept in segments, a few hours, then waking, then a few hours more, while the waymark held its position at the outer docking ring and the quorum ring floated in the middle distance, amber-lit, unchanged, offering nothing. The Assembly had gone dark. No formal response. No procedural acknowledgement. No communication of any kind through any channel. In 14 years of working with the Assembly, Tavin had never experienced a complete communications blackout from them. They were, as a governing body, extraordinarily procedural. They responded to things. They issued receipts for minor exchanges. The silence was not technical. On the morning of the fourth day, a report came through the Waymark's independent intelligence relay, a secure channel Earth's diplomatic corps maintained separately from official assembly communications. The report was short. 3 Vorath compact enforcement fleets, which had been positioned in sectors adjacent to human colonial space for the past several weeks, had moved, not toward human systems, away from them. They had repositioned in defensive formations around Vorath core worlds, 3 of the compact's most significant inhabited systems, and they were staying there. Tavin read the report twice, then a third time. A defensive repositioning is a specific kind of military posture. It means something has happened that has changed the calculation of what needs protecting. When a species that has been facing outward, toward a potential adversary, suddenly turns inward and positions itself between its own home worlds and everything else, it is not preparing to enforce anything. It is reassessing what it is afraid of. The Vorath Compact was not getting ready to implement the quarantine. They were getting ready to protect themselves from something they had not previously felt they needed protection from. Tavin sat with that for a long time. Essen came to see him on the afternoon of the fourth day. No advance message. He simply appeared at the Waymark's docking bay and asked, through the external comm, if he could come aboard. Tavin let him in. They sat in the small meeting room off the main corridor, 2 mugs of tea between them, the Waymark's atmospheric hum the only sound. Essen looked different from when they had spoken in the alcove. The careful, measured quality was still there. The Pellan researcher's composure, built from 4,000 years of cultural practice, did not simply disappear. But underneath it, something had shifted. He looked like a person whose model of how something worked had stopped being accurate, and who was still in the early stages of understanding what that meant. "I want to tell you something," he said. "I want to be clear that I am doing so on my own judgment. This is not officially sanctioned." "I understand," Tavin said. Essen reached into his bag and produced a data card, not the same one from the alcove, a different one, thinner. He set it on the table between them. The 3 elders who had blocked the proposed measure had made their statement jointly. Essen had already told Tavin this. What he had not told him was the full text. He had not felt it was appropriate at the time. He had since reconsidered. "The relevant portion," Essen said, "reads as follows." He looked at the card. "After reviewing the complete observational archive on the human civilization, covering 112 years of documentation, we find that we are unable to recommend any action intended to terminate or permanently restrict this species' development. Our reasons are as follows." He paused. "Read the 3 reasons in full. The 11 projection models all producing the same result. The historical record with no example of permanent decline. The belief that attempting to impose a ceiling would produce a version of humanity no longer interested in assembly membership." Then he stopped. "The final sentence of their statement," he said, "was the one that ended the discussion." He read it without inflection. "We have watched the recordings of their history. We will not be the civilization that provokes them. If we are wrong about this, we will discover our error. If we are right, history will record that we were wise enough to know what we were looking at." Tavin did not say anything for a moment. "Which elder wrote the last line?" he asked. He already knew the answer. He asked anyway. "All 3, Essen said. "A single joint document. None of them would take individual credit." Tavin looked at his tea. It had gone cold. He noticed this as a fact rather than an inconvenience. "What happens now?" he asked. Essen was quiet for a moment. "The Assembly has convened a closed session, not about the quarantine, not about any of the conditions in the final notice. The agenda, as described to me by someone who was present for the opening of the session, is this question." He paused. "How does the Assembly build a functional relationship with a civilization it cannot contain, cannot reliably predict, and cannot outpace?" He picked up his tea, set it back down. "There is no existing framework for this," he said. "In the Assembly's history, this question has never been asked. Every civilization, however capable, has eventually followed a trajectory the Assembly could model. Your species is the first for which our analysts cannot produce a confident long-range projection." He looked at Tavin. "Because you keep surprising yourselves." He stood to leave. At the door he stopped. "I want you to know," he said, "that I do not think the Assembly is your enemy. I also do not think they are your friends. I think they are a very old institution that has spent thousands of years believing it understood the range of what was possible. And you have spent 31 years quietly dismantling that belief without meaning to." A pause. "That is a genuinely difficult thing to manage." "I know," Tavin said. Essen nodded and left. That evening, a communique arrived through the formal diplomatic channel. The sender was listed as the office of Provost Kalun Drath of the Vorath Compact. This was unusual. The Vorath communicated through assembly channels as a matter of standard practice. They had done so for 11,000 years. A direct communication from Drath's personal office, bypassing assembly protocol entirely, was in diplomatic terms the equivalent of a very old, very formal institution deciding to knock on the door rather than send a courier. The message contained 4 words. They were written in English, standard human English in the Roman alphabet, without translation notation, without diplomatic preamble. Tavan had been in this chamber for 14 years. In 14 years, Provost Kalun Drath had never been documented to speak, write, or read human English in any capacity, public or private. "We understand you now." Tavan read the 4 words, set the communicator on the desk, stood at the observation port for a long time. The quorum ring floated in the middle distance, amber gold, enormous, full of very old minds working through questions they had not previously needed to ask. Beyond it, stars, hundreds of them visible from this position. Some of them home to civilizations that had watched humanity for a century, studied it, filed reports on it, feared it a little in their way, and were now sitting with an understanding they had not quite had 4 days ago. The waymark was quiet. Tavan stood at the window until the amber light of the ring's evening cycle began to deepen, and then he went to his desk and wrote a brief message to Earth. He kept it short. 6 months later, Tavan's soul was sitting in his kitchen in the city of Vernus, drinking the same coffee he had been drinking since his 2nd year of graduate school, watching morning light move across the kitchen floor, and doing absolutely nothing of diplomatic significance whatsoever. It was, without question, one of the better mornings he could remember. His resignation had been processed 3 weeks after his return from the quorum ring. It had been accepted without ceremony, which he had appreciated. The diplomatic corps had identified his replacement before he had finished the paperwork. Her name was Amara Vale. 31 years old, a linguist from the Loris Institute, fluent in 14 languages and working on a 15th, with a research background in interspecies communication theory. When Tavan had met her at the formal handover briefing, she had listened to everything he said over 2 hours with total attention, asked 3 questions at the end that demonstrated she had understood all of it and had already thought 2 steps further, and then waited with patient courtesy for him to stop talking. He had driven home from that meeting feeling something he had not expected. Genuine relief. Not the relief of someone escaping a weight, but the specific relief of someone who has been carrying something important for a long time and has passed it into hands that are, honestly, better suited for it. This morning, Amara's first formal address to the Accord Assembly was being broadcast on the relay feed. Tavan had the audio running on the living room screen with the volume low and the kitchen door open, an old habit from years of monitoring sessions while doing other things. He could hear her clearly enough. She was speaking about water. Specifically, she was laying the groundwork for a hydrological survey data-sharing agreement with 4 assembly species that had conducted research in the 3 colonial systems that Earth's new colonization fleets were in the process of reaching. These species had water resource data that would be enormously useful for settlement planning. Amara was negotiating access to that data in exchange for agricultural technology humanity had spent 50 years developing. She was accepting each offer of technical support graciously and folding it into a framework that gave humanity full operational autonomy while keeping the relationships warm. It was careful, precise, practical work, the kind that would never be reported as news anywhere, the kind that would matter to every person who eventually settled those planets and needed to know where to dig. Tavan listened for a while and thought, she does not even know she is doing it. It comes naturally because she grew up in a world where certain principles had already been established, and those principles were simply part of how she understood things to work. That was the relay. That was how it actually functioned, not as a monument, but as a starting point. Each generation beginning further along the road because the one before had already walked it and left markers. The mistakes he had made in his first 3 years as an envoy, he had made so that Amara would not have to. She was starting from further along than he had started, and whoever came after her would start from further along still. Through the kitchen doorway, he heard her shift from the water rights discussion to atmospheric compatibility indices, her voice taking on the slightly more precise register she used when moving between subjects. 3 assembly scientific bodies had offered technical support. She was accepting each one. He refilled his coffee and went outside. His daughter Lena was in the garden, or rather, she was in the grass beyond the garden, lying on her back with her arms at her sides, looking up at the sky. She was 12. She had been deeply unimpressed by Tavin's former career since the moment he had tried to explain what it involved, in a way that he found both humbling and, on reflection, entirely appropriate. He sat on the low step by the back door. The sky above Vernus was clear that morning, a wide autumn blue, the kind that came after the first cold nights of the season, when the air was clean enough to make the color look almost artificial. No clouds. A long, clean arc from one end of the garden wall to the other. Lena sat up. "You're thinking about the assembly again?" she said, not a question. "A little," he admitted. She considered this with the gravity that 12-year-olds bring to things they have decided are worth considering. Are they going to be okay? She meant it genuinely. This was something Tavin had come to understand about his daughter. She asked questions she actually wanted answered, which was rarer than it should have been. He thought about Amara in the chamber, building an agreement one careful sentence at a time. He thought about the Surath trade convoy that had arrived at the outer colonial hub 6 weeks after his return. A gentle, long-memory species that had been politically invisible in assembly debates for centuries, now bringing materials in short supply in exchange for agricultural technology they had never seen. 11 days, both sides reported it as successful. He thought about the Velorn, whose instruments were used across the assembly's range for scientific measurement, who had sent a direct message to the Secretary-General bypassing assembly protocol entirely and received a reply within 24 hours. He thought about Essen's most recent message, which had mentioned, briefly, and with the careful hedging of someone sharing something they were not entirely sure they should, that a memo had been filed in the Tessarine archive under restricted circulation. The memo's subject line was a question. It had been accessed 44 times. No one had written an answer beneath it. He thought about the Vorath fleets, still in their defensive positions around the core worlds. Not retreating, not advancing. Simply present, the institutional equivalent of a lock on a door that the owner no longer expected to need, but was not yet ready to remove. "I think so," he said. "I think it's going to take a long time. And it's going to be complicated, and neither side is going to understand the other as well as they'd like for quite a while. But yes, I think so." Lena nodded, apparently satisfied, and lay back down in the grass. Tavin looked up at the sky. Somewhere in the Tessarine archive, in a section marked for restricted circulation only, a document had been filed. Its subject line was a question that very old minds had posed to themselves and had not yet answered, perhaps because there was no answer yet, or perhaps because the act of asking it was itself the beginning of something that would take generations to complete. The question had been accessed 44 times. Each time the person accessing it had apparently read it, closed it, and left the answer field empty. What do we do if there is no ceiling? Nobody had answered it yet. Nobody was going to answer it for a very long time. And on the ground below the arc of an autumn sky, in the grass behind a low stone wall in the city of Vernus, a 12-year-old who was not worried about any of this had already gone back to looking at the stars.